I never thought building my own home would lead to a war. For 30 years, my cabin in Whispering Pines was my sanctuary, a place I'd built with my own two hands on a plot of land that was more forest than suburb. My wife Eleanor and I had raised our daughter here, surrounded by the quiet hum of nature and the easy, unspoken agreements of good neighbors. We had a homeowners association, technically, but for decades it was just a flimsy excuse to collect a couple $100s a year from everyone to keep the main road graded and the trash hauled away. It was a means to an end, a tool to maintain our shared peace, not a weapon to enforce someone's will. My name is Franklin Miller, but most folks just call me Frank. I spent 40 years as a carpenter and general contractor, so I know a thing or two about how things are put together and, more importantly, how they fall apart. After Eleanor passed and our daughter Sarah moved to the city to become a structural engineer, this cabin became more than just a house. It was a living museum of my life, every log and joint a memory. I liked my quiet routine, coffee on the porch, tinkering in my workshop, and the occasional chat with my neighbors, the Hendersons, a lovely couple who'd lived here even longer than I had. Then, Carol moved in. She bought the old Hemlock place down the road, a modern monstrosity of glass and steel that looked as out of place among the pines as a spaceship. She came from the city, and she brought the city's mentality with her. The idea that every single thing had to be managed, regulated, and standardized. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a haircut so sharp it looked like it could cut you, and a voice that had a permanent note of condescending disappointment. She saw our quiet, live-and-let-live community not as a haven, but as a project to be fixed. Within 6 months, she had somehow maneuvered her way into becoming the president of the HOA. The old president, a retired fellow named George, was happy to hand over the reins, tired of chasing down the few people who were late with their dues. None of us thought much of it. We figured she'd be a little more enthusiastic, maybe get the road paved a bit quicker. We had no idea we were handing the keys of our tiny kingdom to a petty tyrant. The changes started small, almost laughably so. An email went out, formatted in an aggressive, bold font, declaring that all mailboxes had to be a uniform shade of forest green, with brass numbers of a specific size. A few people grumbled, but most of us, myself included, figured it was an easy enough thing to do to keep the peace. I spent a Saturday afternoon repainting my mailbox, shaking my head at the absurdity. Then came the rule about garbage cans. They could not be visible from the road except between the hours of 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening on pickup day. Mrs. Gable, a single mother of two who worked long hours as a nurse, got a $25 fine because she didn't get home until 7 and her cans were still at the curb. That was the first time I felt a real stir of unease. It wasn't about community standards anymore. It was about control. Carol's reign was a slow, creeping infection. She created a whole new book of bylaws, a thick, spiral-bound monstrosity that she'd apparently written herself. She claimed the old, single-page charter was legally insufficient. Suddenly, there were rules about the acceptable species of flowers you could plant, the maximum height of a woodpile, and the prohibition of any vehicle with commercial lettering being parked in a driveway for more than an hour. She would patrol the neighborhood in her golf cart, a clipboard on her lap, a look of grim satisfaction on her face as she scribbled down violations. The community, once a place of friendly waves, became tense. People started looking over their shoulders, worried that the color of their welcome mat was about to earn them a formal reprimand. I did my best to ignore it. I kept my property neat, paid my dues on time, and tried to remain invisible. My cabin was set back from the road, partially hidden by a thick stand of blue spruce I'd planted years ago. I figured if she couldn't see me, she couldn't bother me. For a while, it worked. I was just the quiet old man in the woods, and she had bigger fish to fry, like the family who dared to put up a basketball hoop without submitting a triplicate application to her newly formed Architectural Review Committee, which consisted of herself and a nervous-looking man who always seemed to agree with her. The initial tolerance most of us had shown was curdling into a quiet, simmering resentment. We were all just waiting for something to finally break. The break came in the form of the biggest snowstorm our region had seen in 50 years. It started on a Thursday night, a few gentle flakes, and by Friday morning it was a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled through the pines, and the snow came down not in flakes, but in thick, heavy sheets. By Saturday morning, the world was silent and white. I measured over 3 feet on my porch, with drifts that were easily twice that high. Our single road in and out of Whispering Pines was completely impassable. We were cut off. Normally, this wouldn't be a catastrophe. The HOA had a contract with a local plowing company, but as the day wore on and the snow finally stopped, the road remained buried. I called the company's number and got a recording. They were overwhelmed, digging out emergency services and main thoroughfares first. Our little private road was at the bottom of a very long list. They said it could be days, maybe a week. For most of us, this was an inconvenience. For my neighbors, the Hendersons, it was a crisis. Arthur Henderson was 82 and needed to get to the hospital for dialysis 3 times a week. His next appointment was Monday morning. I looked out my window at their house, nearly swallowed by a massive drift. I thought of Martha Henderson, probably worried sick. I had a solution sitting in my driveway. A trusty, if slightly rusty, 4-wheel drive pickup with a heavy-duty plow attachment. I used it to clear my own long driveway, but I'd never had to tackle the main road before. It wasn't my job. It wasn't my responsibility. But Arthur needed to get out. It was as simple as that. I pulled on my boots, fired up the old truck, and got to work. It was slow, heavy going. The snow was wet and dense, and I had to take it in small bites, pushing a wall of white to the side of the road, then backing up and doing it again. It took me nearly 3 hours just to clear the stretch from my driveway to the Hendersons and then to carve out a path for their car. Arthur came out onto his porch, bundled in a heavy coat, and gave me a grateful wave. I just nodded back, then turned my attention to the rest of the road. If I was going to do this, I might as well do it right. I decided to clear a single lane all the way to the main highway, about a mile away. I was about halfway done, the engine groaning in protest, when I saw a figure marching down the middle of the path I'd just cleared. It was Carol. She was wearing a pristine white snowsuit that made her look like the Michelin Man's angry wife. She was waving her arms, and even over the roar of the diesel engine, I could tell she was yelling. I put the truck in neutral and rolled down my window, letting in a blast of frigid air. "What's the problem, Carol?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "The problem?" she shrieked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The problem is this. This is a complete violation. You are performing unauthorized road maintenance with unapproved equipment. The HOA has a bonded and insured contractor for this service." She was practically vibrating with fury. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "Carol, the contractor isn't coming. Arthur Henderson has to get to a dialysis appointment on Monday. What was I supposed to do? Let him get trapped back here?" Her face was a mask of indignation. "That is not your concern. It is the responsibility of the individual homeowner to make their own emergency arrangements. Your personal, non-commercial vehicle is not rated for this kind of work. You are churning up the gravel bed and creating a massive liability for the community. What if you damage the road? Who do you think is going to pay for that?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. The road was a simple dirt and gravel track. My plow blade was set high, just skimming the top of the snow. The only thing I was hurting was my truck's transmission. "I'm not damaging anything," I said, my patience wearing thin. "I'm just clearing a path so people can get out." She jabbed a gloved finger at me. "Cease and desist immediately, Mr. Miller. I am giving you a formal verbal warning. If you continue, the HOA will have no choice but to levy significant fines for violating community bylaws, Section 12, subsection C, unauthorized alteration of common areas. Furthermore, your vehicle itself is a violation of the aesthetic code." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "My truck is an aesthetic violation?" That was the wrong thing to do. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits. "This is not a laughing matter. You are creating a hazard and flagrantly disregarding the rules that hold this community together. Stop this immediately, or you will face the consequences." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, her boots crunching angrily in the snow. I watched her go. a cold knot forming in my stomach. I looked toward the Hendersons' house, then down the long, uncleared stretch of road. I put the truck back in gear and lowered the plow. I still had work to do. The first letter arrived on Tuesday, delivered by a very grateful mail carrier who was only able to get through because of the path I had cleared. It was in a crisp, official-looking envelope with the Whispering Pines HOA logo that Carol had designed. A pretentious-looking pine tree inside a perfect circle. The letter formally cited me for the violations she had screamed about in the snow. It included a $100 fine for unauthorized road maintenance and another $50 fine for aesthetic violation, unapproved commercial-grade equipment. It ended with a stern warning that failure to pay within 30 days would result in additional late fees. I read it, snorted, and tossed it onto the pile of junk mail on my counter. It was ludicrous. I had provided an essential service that the HOA itself had failed to deliver. I had helped my neighbors in a time of need. If Carol wanted to fine me for that, she could pound sand. Later that day, Martha Henderson brought over a warm apple pie. "Frank, we don't know how to thank you," she said, her eyes welling up. "Arthur got to his appointment this morning with no trouble at all. We heard about Carol confronting you. Don't you worry. If she tries anything, the whole neighborhood will stand with you." I appreciated the sentiment, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be that simple. A week later, I was on my porch, replacing a rotting board, when I saw Carol's golf cart creeping down my driveway. I sighed and put down my hammer. She came to a stop a few feet away, holding her clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Miller," she began, without any preamble, "I am here to conduct a follow-up inspection regarding the unapproved construction on your porch." I stared at her, then at the single board I had pried up. "I'm replacing a rotten plank, Carol. It's called maintenance." She made a little tisk sound. "All exterior modifications, including repairs, require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee to ensure they meet community standards for materials and workmanship. I don't see an application on file for this." This was a new level of insanity. "You're telling me I need to fill out a form in triplicate to replace one board?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Rules are rules, Mr. Miller," she said, a smug little smile playing on her lips. "They apply to everyone equally. I'm afraid I'll have to issue a citation. That will be a $75 fine." She scribbled on her clipboard, tore off a sheet, and held it out to me. I just stared at her hand until she awkwardly placed the paper on the porch railing. She was baiting me, pushing to see how far she could go. I had a strong feeling this was retaliation for the plowing incident. The fines became a regular occurrence. My woodpile was stacked 2 inches too high. A small patch of moss was growing on a shingle on my workshop roof. I had apparently parked my truck improperly in my own driveway, with the front bumper not perfectly aligned with the edge of the gravel. Each new imagined infraction came with a letter and a fine. I ignored them all. My junk mail pile was becoming an impressive monument to her pettiness. But my quiet defiance only seemed to enrage her. She was a predator who had tasted blood, and my refusal to cower was a direct challenge to her authority. The conflict started to spill over and affect others, just as I'd feared. The mail carrier Tom told me Carol had filed a formal complaint against him with the post office for expressing unprofessional opinions after he'd thanked me for plowing the road in front of her. Then she declared that a large, beautiful old boulder at the community entrance, a landmark that had been there for a century, was a non-compliant decorative element and had it removed, leaving an ugly, muddy patch. It was a senseless act of vandalism done in the name of order. People were furious, but her weapon was the bylaw book, and she wielded it with impunity. No one wanted to be her next target. The Hendersons were not spared. Carol sent them a notice that the small ramp I'd built for Arthur years ago to help him get up the front steps was not compliant with her new, ridiculously stringent aesthetic codes. She demanded they remove it. When Martha called me, she was in tears. That was when my frustration hardened into cold, clear anger. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about cruelty. This was about a bully getting her kicks by tormenting people who couldn't fight back. The breaking point for me came a month after the snowstorm. Another official-looking envelope arrived, this one sent by certified mail. Inside was a statement of all my unpaid fines, which, with late fees and penalties, now totaled over $2,000. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter informed me that, pursuant to the HOA bylaws, a lien had been placed on my property for the full amount. My home, the cabin I had built with my own hands, the place where I had raised my family, was now legally encumbered because of a mossy shingle and a crookedly parked truck. I felt a surge of hot, white rage, followed by a chilling sense of dread. A lien was a serious legal tool. It meant I couldn't sell or refinance my home without paying her off first. It was a cloud on my title, a legal stain on my sanctuary. This had gone far beyond petty harassment. This was a declaration of total war. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the letter clenched in my fist. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew would understand both the technicalities and the injustice of it all, my daughter, Sarah. "She put a lien on your house?" Sarah's voice on the other end of the line was a mixture of disbelief and fury. I had explained the whole saga to her, from the snowplowing to the porch board to the final, outrageous legal threat. For $2,000 in fake fines? Dad, that's insane, and probably illegal. As a structural engineer, Sarah dealt with building codes, municipal regulations, and legal contracts every day. She had a low tolerance for bureaucratic nonsense and an even lower tolerance for bullies. "I know it's illegal," I said, "or at least it should be. But this woman, Carol, she's got this whole book of rules she waves around like it's gospel. I don't know what's in it, but she seems to think it gives her the power to do whatever she wants." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, her tone shifting from angry daughter to professional problem solver. "First, don't talk to her anymore. Don't answer her calls. Don't engage with her if she comes to your door. Second, you need a lawyer. Someone who specializes in this kind of HOA garbage. I know a guy. His name is David Davis. He's sharp and he hates petty tyrants." She gave me his number and I called him the next morning. Mr. Davis was a calm, methodical man who listened patiently as I recounted the entire story. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "Frank, you've walked into a classic petty dictatorship," he said. "These situations are ugly. The laws in this state tend to favor HOAs, giving them broad powers. This woman, Carol, is likely overstepping her authority, especially with the lien, but proving it and fighting it can be a long and expensive process." He agreed to take the case, but he was blunt about the challenge ahead. "She has a set of filed bylaws and a paper trail of violations, no matter how ridiculous," he explained. "To a judge, it might look like you're just a disgruntled resident who doesn't want to follow the rules. Our first step is to formally challenge the lien and demand a complete copy of all the association's governing documents, meeting minutes, and financial records. We need to see exactly what rule she thinks gives her the authority to do this." He told me his retainer fee, and I agreed without hesitation. The money was secondary now. This was a matter of principle. While Mr. Davis began the legal paperwork, I started my own investigation. I remembered something Martha Henderson had said, that the whole neighborhood would stand with me. I knew they were scared, but I also knew they were angry. I decided it was time to talk to my oldest neighbor, Arthur Wallace. Not Arthur Henderson, but a different Arthur, a retired history professor who had been one of the first people to build a house in Whispering Pines. He was in his late 80s, sharp as a tack, and had served on the original HOA board. If anyone knew the real rules, it was him. I found him tending his rose bushes, a hobby Carol had recently tried to regulate by issuing a list of approved cultivars. "Frank," he said, smiling as I approached. "Come to admire my non-compliant blooms?" I chuckled. "Something like that, Arthur. I actually need your help. I need to know about the old HOA, the real one, before Carol." Arthur's smile faded. He invited me inside, and we sat in his study, a room filled with books from floor to ceiling. He listened intently as I told him about the lien. "A lien," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "I'm not surprised. Power like that in the hands of a person with no character is a dangerous thing. He got up and went to an old filing cabinet. After a moment of rummaging, he pulled out a thin, dusty folder. "Here it is," he said, handing it to me. "The original Articles of Incorporation and Bylaws of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, circa 1978. I opened the folder. Inside were 3 typewritten pages, yellowed with age. I read through them, my astonishment growing with every line. The document was simple, direct, and sensible. It established the HOA for the sole purpose of maintaining the common road and arranging for refuse collection. It laid out a simple process for electing a 3-person board and for collecting annual dues. And then I saw the most important part, a single paragraph that made my heart beat faster. It stated that any amendment to the bylaws or the creation of new ones required a formal vote with a 2/3 majority of all homeowners present at an annual meeting. "Arthur," I said, looking up from the page, "I've never voted on any new bylaws, have you?" He shook his head grimly. "Never. The last vote we had on anything was 5 years ago to increase the dues by $20 to cover the rising cost of trash pickup." We spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone, calling every long-term resident in the community. The story was the same from everyone. No one had ever seen Carol's new rulebook before it was printed. No one had ever been asked to vote on it. The truth was starting to become clear. Carol hadn't amended the bylaws. She had staged a coup. She had created her own set of rules out of thin air and was governing us under a completely fraudulent document. Mr. Davis was ecstatic when I told him. "This is it, Frank," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "This is the crack in her armor. If she can't prove those bylaws were legally ratified, then every single action she's taken under them, every fine, every warning, and especially that lien, is null and void." He immediately filed a new motion, demanding proof of the vote that ratified Carol's rulebook. The request for documents sent Carol into a frenzy. A week later, a thick package arrived at Mr. Davis's office. It contained her spiral-bound book of rules and a copy of the meeting minutes from a supposed special meeting held shortly after she became president. The minutes claimed that the new bylaws were presented and approved by unanimous consent. The document was signed by her as president and by the nervous man from the architectural committee as secretary. "Unanimous consent?" I said to Mr. Davis over the phone. "That's a bald-faced lie. I was never even notified of such a meeting." "Of course you weren't," he replied, "because it almost certainly never happened. Now we have her. Falsifying corporate records is a serious offense." But there was more. The package also included the HOA's financial statements for the past year. Mr. Davis, who had a background in forensic accounting, started digging. What he found was even more damning than the fake bylaws. He found invoices for thousands of dollars in community beautification projects that corresponded to extensive, high-end landscaping work done on Carol's own property. He found a recurring monthly consulting fee of $500 being paid to a company called Strategic Governance Solutions. A quick search revealed the company was registered to Carol's brother-in-law and operated out of a post office box. And the final nail in the coffin, the snow removal contract. The company she had claimed was bonded and insured was owned by her cousin. It had been in business for less than a month before the contract was awarded, had no physical address, and owned no equipment. The HOA had paid them a $10,000 retainer up front. They had simply cashed the check and disappeared, which is why they never showed up during the storm. It wasn't just a case of a power-hungry bully anymore. This was calculated, premeditated fraud. Carol hadn't just been creating rules. She'd been systematically looting the community's coffers to enrich herself and her family. The revelation was staggering. All her posturing about standards and rules had just been a smokescreen for simple, grubby theft. Her rage at me for plowing the road suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just that I had defied her authority. I had unknowingly exposed her fraudulent contract by doing the job her phantom company was paid for but never intended to do. My simple act of neighborly kindness had poked a hole in her entire corrupt enterprise. Armed with this mountain of evidence, the fraudulent bylaws, the falsified meeting minutes, the invoices for her personal landscaping, the consulting fees to her brother-in-law, the sham snow removal contract, we finally had the leverage we needed. The dynamic had shifted completely. We were no longer on the defensive, fighting a lien. We were on the offensive, preparing to dismantle a criminal operation. Mr. Davis advised against going to the authorities immediately. "She'll just lawyer up and stall," he said. "Our best move is to expose her publicly, in front of the entire community she's been fleecing. We need to completely destroy her power base." The annual HOA meeting was scheduled in 3 weeks. It was the perfect venue for a public execution. As we prepared our strategy, Carol, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, decided to make her final, fatal move. She was still fixated on me, the one resident who had openly defied her. The lien hadn't made me bend, so she decided she needed to break me. Another certified letter arrived. This one was from the HOA's lawyer, a name I didn't recognize. It stated that based on numerous violations and a general state of disrepair, my cabin was being declared a potential hazard to the community. The letter went on to say that the HOA board had voted to commission an independent structural engineering inspection of my property. If the engineer's report found the structure to be unsafe or not in compliance with modern building codes, the HOA would petition the county to have it condemned. It was the nuclear option. She wasn't just trying to fine me or lien my property anymore. She was trying to take my home away, to have it torn down. I read the letter, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of real fear. My cabin was solid, I knew that. But I also knew how pliable experts could be when they were being paid by someone with a specific agenda. I immediately called Sarah. I read her the letter. There was a long silence on the other end. "She's going to have it condemned?" Sarah finally said, her voice dangerously quiet. "My home. The one you grew up in. The one I built." "Dad," she said, and the tone in her voice was one I hadn't heard in years. A cold, hard fury that I knew she reserved for the worst kinds of injustices. "Don't you worry about a thing. Let her hire her engineer. Let her schedule her inspection. Just let me know when it is." Her confidence was so absolute it startled me. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" I asked. "Just trust me, Dad," she replied. "This is going to be fun." The day of the inspection arrived a week later. It was a bright, crisp autumn morning. I was on the porch, waiting, a thermos of coffee on the table next to me. At precisely 9 o'clock, Carol's golf cart came zipping up my driveway. She wasn't alone. Beside her sat a young woman in a hard hat, carrying a clipboard and a large case of equipment. Carol brought the cart to a halt and stepped out, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. This was her moment of victory, and she was savoring it. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "As per the official notice, we are here to conduct the structural integrity assessment of your dwelling." She gestured grandly to the woman beside her. "This is the independent engineer I've retained. She comes highly recommended, with extensive experience in code compliance and safety assessments. I'll let her introduce herself." The young woman stepped forward, pulling off her hard hat. She had familiar brown eyes and a smile that I knew better than my own. "Hello," she said, her voice clear and professional. "My name is Sarah Miller. I'm the structural engineer for this assessment." The smirk on Carol's face didn't just vanish, it imploded. Her jaw dropped, and her face went through a rapid series of colors, from pale white to blotchy red. She looked from Sarah to me and back again, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Miller," she sputtered, You're his." Sarah's professional smile didn't waver. "He's my father, yes. Is that a problem, Mrs. Thompson? You hired my firm, Apex Engineering Solutions, based on our qualifications. I am the lead engineer assigned to this region. I can assure you, I will conduct a thorough and impartial inspection as my professional ethics demand." I had to turn away to hide my grin. I took a long sip of coffee. I had no idea this was Sarah's plan. She had simply told me to trust her. Apparently, Her firm was one of the most respected in the state, and Carol, in her haste to find a credible-looking hangman, had simply hired the best without bothering to look at the name on the door. Carol stood there, utterly paralyzed. She had walked right into the most perfect trap imaginable. For the next 3 hours, Sarah conducted the most meticulous and comprehensive inspection my cabin had ever undergone. She tapped walls, measured beam deflections, took core samples from the foundation, and made copious notes, all with a detached professionalism that drove Carol, who was forced to trail along, into a state of silent, twitching fury. The annual HOA meeting was held that following Saturday in the local community hall. The room was packed. Word of the impending condemnation vote and the bizarre inspection had spread like wildfire. For the first time in years, nearly every homeowner was in attendance. The air was thick with tension. Carol, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, sat at a table at the front, looking pale but resolute. She had recovered her composure and was clearly determined to see this through to the bitter end. The meeting began with boring procedural matters, but everyone knew what the main event was. Finally, Carol stood up and approached the podium. She cleared her throat and began her speech, her voice regaining its familiar, imperious tone. She spoke of the importance of standards, of protecting property values, of ensuring the safety of the community. She painted me as a rogue element, a defiant troublemaker who refused to comply with reasonable rules and whose dilapidated shack was a blight on the neighborhood. Therefore, she concluded, her voice ringing with self-righteousness, the board has determined that the property at 12 Pine Ridge Lane poses a significant risk. We commissioned an expert, independent structural analysis, and we will now hear the results of that report. I call the engineer, Miss Miller, to the podium. A hush fell over the room as Sarah walked to the front. She placed her laptop on the podium and connected it to the projector. Carol sat down, a look of grim anticipation on her face. She clearly believed that Sarah, whatever her relation to me, would be bound by professional duty to report any and all flaws, which Carol could then spin into a condemnation order. Sarah looked out at the assembled faces of our community. "Good evening," she began. "I was retained by the HOA to conduct a structural assessment of the residence at 12 Pine Ridge Lane, owned by Franklin Miller." She paused and looked directly at Carol, "who is, as you now all know, my father." A murmur went through the crowd. Sarah clicked a button, and an image of my cabin appeared on the screen behind her. My inspection was, if anything, more rigorous than usual to preclude any accusations of bias. I am prepared to stake my professional license on my findings. She clicked again, bringing up a slide with bold green text. The conclusion of my report is this. The structure at 12 Pine Ridge Lane not only meets, but in many areas far exceeds all current state and local building codes. It is one of the most structurally sound and well-maintained residential buildings I have had the privilege of inspecting in my career. Any attempt to declare it unsafe would be a malicious and fraudulent abuse of process. The room erupted. People started cheering and applauding. I saw Arthur Wallace give me a huge thumbs up. Carol's face was a thundercloud. She jumped to her feet. "This is a farce! She's biased! Her report is worthless!" she shrieked. But Sarah wasn't finished. She held up a hand for silence. "Madam President, you are correct about one thing. I did uncover evidence of malicious and fraudulent activity," she said, her voice turning to ice. "But it has nothing to do with my father's house." She clicked the remote. The image of my cabin was replaced by a copy of the HOA's original 3-page bylaws. "This," Sarah announced, "is the only legally ratified governing document of the Whispering Pines HOA." Click. A copy of Carol's thick rulebook appeared. "And this is a fraudulent document, never presented to the homeowners, never voted upon, and illegally filed with the county. Every action taken under its authority is void." The room went dead silent. Click. A bank statement appeared with a highlighted line item. "This is an invoice for $4,000 for common area beautification, paid by the HOA. And this," click, a photo of Carol's newly landscaped yard appeared, "is where that money actually went." Gasps rippled through the hall. Sarah continued, her voice like a hammer. Click. This is a $500 monthly consulting fee paid to a shell corporation owned by Carol Thompson's brother-in-law. Click. And this is the $10,000 contract awarded to a non-existent snow removal company owned by her cousin. She presented it all, piece by piece, an undeniable, methodical demolition of Carol's entire reign. When she was done, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the room exploded in a cacophony of angry shouting. Carol stood frozen, her face ashen. Her two board members were slowly pushing their chairs away from her, as if she were radioactive. "Lies! It's all lies! A conspiracy!" she stammered, but her voice was drowned out by the fury of the people she had cheated. At that moment, Mr. Davis, my lawyer, stood up from his seat in the front row. "For the record," he announced in a loud, clear voice, "copies of all this evidence, including sworn affidavits from numerous residents, were filed with the district attorney's office yesterday afternoon." As if on cue, two uniformed sheriff's deputies, who had been standing discreetly at the back of the hall, began walking down the center aisle, their expressions grim. Carol's authority didn't just crumble, it was obliterated in a public spectacle of her own making. She had built her gallows, and Sarah had just kicked the chair out from under her. The deputies reached the front table and stopped beside Carol. "Carol Thompson," one of them said, his voice calm but firm, "you are under arrest for suspicion of embezzlement, wire fraud, and forgery." Her face, which had been a mask of rage, crumpled into disbelief and then terror. She started to babble, protesting her innocence, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a vendetta by a disgruntled resident. But no one was listening. The spell was broken. The deputies cuffed her hands behind her back and led her out of the community hall, past the silent, staring faces of the neighbors she had tormented and stolen from. The petty tyrant of Whispering Pines was a tyrant no more. In the aftermath of Carol's spectacular downfall, a sense of profound relief washed over the community. It felt like waking up from a long, anxious dream. The interim board, led by a hastily appointed Arthur Wallace, immediately declared all of Carol's bylaws null and void. All outstanding fines were canceled, and Mr. Davis worked swiftly to have the illegal lien removed from my property title. My name was cleared, completely and publicly. I was no longer the neighborhood scofflaw. I was the man who had stood up to the bully. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months stopped by to shake my hand, to apologize for not speaking up sooner, and to thank me for what I'd done. I was a reluctant hero, but a hero nonetheless. The legal process against Carol was swift and decisive. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence Sarah had compiled, her case was hopeless. The district attorney brought a slate of charges against her. She was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The judge was particularly scathing in his sentencing, noting that she had not only stolen money, but had also poisoned a peaceful community with fear and intimidation. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, a figure that amounted to nearly $50,000. Her house, the glass and steel monument to her arrogance, was sold to cover the debt. With Carol gone, Whispering Pines began to heal. The first act of the new board, with Arthur Wallace officially elected as president, was to hold a community bonfire. Everyone was invited to bring their copies of Carol's fraudulent rulebook. We watched them burn, the pages curling into ash, and it felt like a cleansing ritual. We reinstated the old, simple 3-page bylaws, the ones designed to serve the community, not enslave it. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded with a unanimous vote. People started painting their mailboxes whatever color they pleased. The Hendersons' ramp stayed right where it was, and the family down the road put their basketball hoop back up. The atmosphere changed almost overnight. The tension was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers about the latest violation notice, but in friendly chats over the fence. We held a community potluck to celebrate, and the turnout was incredible. It felt like we were all getting to know each other again, bonded by our shared experience of surviving the reign of Queen Carol. My reputation in the neighborhood was cemented. I was the guy who fought the HOA and won. But more than that, I was just Frank again, the guy who could help you with a leaky faucet or lend you a tool from his workshop. My life returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was a richer, more connected quiet than before. A couple of years passed. The community thrived. The stolen money, once repaid, was put into a fund to finally pave the road, a real, professional job this time. Our little neighborhood became known as a great place to live, well-managed, friendly, and blessedly free of petty drama. Property values, which had stagnated under Carol's tyrannical rule, began to climb. Arthur Wallace proved to be a wise and fair leader, managing the HOA's simple duties with common sense and a light touch. My daughter Sarah became a bit of a local legend, the engineer who brought down the corrupt HOA president. She always just laughed when people brought it up. One afternoon, I was in the local grocery store picking up a few things when I saw a familiar figure in the canned goods aisle. It was Carol. She had been released from prison a few months earlier, I'd heard. She looked diminished. The sharp, aggressive haircut was gone, replaced by dull, unstyled hair. The arrogant posture was gone, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked older, tired, and profoundly ordinary. She saw me, and for a second, her eyes widened in panic. She quickly looked away, grabbing a can of soup and hurrying toward the checkout, a shadow of the imperious woman who had tried to ruin my life. I felt no anger, no desire for revenge. I just felt a quiet, detached sense of pity. Her self-inflicted downfall was a far greater punishment than any prison sentence. Looking back on it all now, the whole ridiculous affair taught me a few things. It taught me that bullies, whether on the playground or in an HOA, derive their power from the silence of good people. They thrive on intimidation and the belief that no one will dare to question them. Carol's mistake was picking a fight with someone who was too stubborn to be intimidated and who had a daughter who was a whole lot smarter than she was. It also reinforced a simple truth I've always believed. Rules should be tools, not cages. They're meant to help a community function better, to facilitate peace and cooperation, not to serve the ego of one person who gets a thrill from wielding petty power. In the end, Carol's obsession with control was her undoing. She was so focused on enforcing her made-up rules that she thought she was above the real ones. She built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and it was always destined to collapse. All it took was one person refusing to fold. It took a snowstorm, a stubborn old man in a plow truck, and the love of a daughter who refused to let anyone threaten her father's home. Justice, I've found, doesn't always come from a judge or a jury. Sometimes, it comes when a tyrant's own schemes blow up in their face, leaving them buried in the wreckage. This morning, I sat on my porch, just as I have for 30 years, a warm mug of coffee in my hands. A few snowflakes, the first of the season, were drifting down through the pines, dusting the world in a soft white. The air was clean and cold. I could hear the distant sound of children laughing as they waited for the school bus on the newly paved road. My cabin stood strong and silent around me, a fortress of wood and memory. The war was long over, the peace had been won. And as I watched the snow begin to fall a little heavier, I thought to myself, if it gets deep enough, I might just go plow the road for everyone. Not because of a rule, not because of a contract, but just because that's what good neighbors do. And now, in Whispering Pines, I was lucky enough to have them all around me.